This video discusses complex interpersonal dynamics and psychological fixation. Viewer discretion is advised.
What happens when admiration stops feeling supportive and starts altering the atmosphere of a room? We tend to imagine professional conflict as something obvious, raised voices, disagreements over credit, a visible clash of egos. But some of the most destabilizing dynamics never announce themselves that way. They unfold quietly, through glances that linger, through silences that feel heavier than words, through a presence that no longer feels neutral. At first, nothing looks wrong. The project itself demanded total immersion. It wasn't the kind of work you could compartmentalize or half commit to. For months, Coop and Nic lived inside it. Long hours, shared pressure, constant refinement. The outside world faded into the background. Inside the studio, they were efficient, synchronized, productive. In that closed environment, they made sense. Coop naturally occupied the center of the room, not because he tried to, but because people oriented themselves toward him. He was open, expressive, instinctively attuned to others. Connection came easily to him. Nic worked differently. He was controlled, exacting, intensely focused. He approached the work like a system to be optimized. At first, their contrast felt complementary, and for a while it was. The intensity of the process created a sense of exclusivity, shared frustrations, private jokes, long conversations that blurred the line between work and something more personal. Inside that bubble, it was easy to feel like the partnership existed on a separate plane. Nothing about that felt dangerous, not yet. But that balance relied on one unspoken condition, that the world stayed outside.
The moment the project moved from creation to presentation, the conditions changed. New rooms, new faces, clients, executives, audiences. The private rhythm of the studio gave way to public exposure, and that's when something subtle began to shift. Coop adapted easily. He always did. He spoke fluidly, adjusted to the room, responded with warmth and precision. The presence of others seemed to sharpen his focus rather than dilute it. Nic did not adjust the same way. At first, it was barely noticeable. His explanations remained accurate. His contributions were still technically solid. But his posture changed. His attention narrowed. He stopped engaging with the room as a whole and began orienting himself almost entirely toward Coop. It didn't look dramatic. It looked concentrated. As the meetings continued, the pattern became harder to ignore. Nic's gaze followed Coop constantly. When Coop shifted position, Nic tracked him. When Coop laughed, Nic went still. When Coop directed his attention outward, Nic's focus tightened, as if pulled by something invisible. People in the room felt it before they could articulate it. The energy was uneven, heavy, as if something private was happening in public. At times, Nic interrupted the flow of discussion, not to clarify the project, but to address Coop directly. The questions were specific, narrowly framed, pulling the interaction inward. For brief moments, the rest of the room seemed to disappear. It was as if Nic were trying to recreate the isolation of the studio, right there in front of everyone.
This is usually the point where dynamics either correct themselves or harden. Coop noticed the shift immediately. He didn't confront Nic. He didn't escalate. Instead, he adjusted with precision. His body language angled outward. His gaze moved past Nic instead of meeting it. His tone stayed warm, professional, controlled, but something essential was withdrawn. From the outside, it looked like maturity. Inside the partnership, it registered as distance. Where there had once been easy familiarity, there was now a carefully maintained boundary, an invisible barrier that allowed collaboration but blocked intimacy. Every interaction became slightly more formal, slightly more contained, and for Nic, that change landed hard. The tension followed them beyond the meeting rooms. At a professional dinner, away from the structure of presentations and agendas, the atmosphere thickened. Conversations stalled. Pauses lingered too long. The sense that something unresolved sat between them was unmistakable. What was said that night isn't fully known. What is known is that whatever balance remained didn't survive it. For the final interview, the most important moment of the entire project, Nic didn't appear. No warning, no explanation, no message. Coop faced the panel alone. The project moved forward. The partnership did not. There was no confrontation, no closure, just silence. A silence that swallowed months of shared work and left behind a question no one in the room could quite answer. How something that once felt so aligned could unravel the moment it was exposed to the world. Sometimes the most damaging fractures don't happen during open conflict. They happen when one person realizes that the closeness they believed in doesn't survive visibility. And that's where the story truly begins. To understand what actually happened between Coop and Nic, we have to step away from the emotional weight of the story and look at the structure underneath it. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding, and it wasn't simple professional jealousy. What unfolded follows a pattern that appears frequently in high-intensity creative environments, especially where identity, recognition, and closeness overlap. At the core of this dynamic is what psychology often describes as mirror envy. This isn't the desire to outperform someone or even to take their place. It's the need to stay close to a person whose qualities feel essential to your own sense of worth. In this case, Nic wasn't competing with Coop in a traditional sense. He was orienting himself around Coop as a reference point. Coop's ease, visibility, and social fluency weren't just traits Nic admired. They became qualities Nic felt tethered to. As long as their work existed in isolation, that tether felt stable. The private phase of creation allowed Nic to experience proximity as exclusivity. Inside the studio, the boundary between collaboration and identification blurred. Their shared intensity made it easy to confuse professional alignment with personal fusion. But the moment the project entered the public sphere, that illusion fractured. This brings us to the second mechanism, boundary collapse through enmeshment. Enmeshment occurs when the psychological distance between two people erodes and individual roles begin to merge. Nic's behavior during the presentations, his narrowed focus, his fixation on Coop rather than the audience, his attempts to pull interactions inward weren't random. They were attempts to restore a sense of closeness that had only existed under conditions of isolation. The public setting threatened that closeness, not because it reduced collaboration, but because it introduced other people into a space Nic had mentally defined as private. From Nic's perspective, visibility wasn't neutral, it was loss. This is where possessive monitoring enters the picture. Instead of tracking the success of the project, Nic began tracking Coop's attention. Who he looked at, who he engaged with, how freely he moved through the room. Every outward interaction registered as a kind of subtraction, not from the work, but from Nic's internal sense of connection. That monitoring created tension, not just between them, but in the room itself. When one person is hyper-focused on another, the environment contracts, conversations become strained, energy becomes heavy. This is why observers could feel that something was off without being able to explain it. The discomfort wasn't interpersonal conflict, it was psychological pressure leaking outward. Coop's response is an important part of the pattern. Without escalating or confronting, he instinctively rebuilt boundaries. By redirecting his attention outward, limiting eye contact, and keeping interactions strictly professional, Coop withdrew the feedback that had been sustaining Nic's focus. This wasn't cruelty or dismissal, it was self-preservation. In dynamics like this, any emotional reaction, positive or negative, can reinforce the attachment. Neutrality becomes the only stabilizing move.
But for someone whose sense of connection depends on proximity, neutrality doesn't feel neutral. It feels like erasure. That brings us to the rupture. When Nic was finally treated as what he technically was, a colleague rather than a central emotional reference point, the internal structure he had built collapsed. The disappearance at the final interview wasn't impulsive, it was a form of withdrawal as control. By removing himself completely at the most critical moment, Nic attempted to reassert significance through absence. If presence no longer secured connection, absence would. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in dynamics driven by unresolved envy and enmeshment. When direct influence fails, withdrawal becomes the last available lever. The goal isn't the success of the project anymore. The goal is to restore a sense of impact, even if that impact is destructive. In the end, what dissolved the partnership wasn't ambition or rivalry, it was the inability to tolerate separation between roles, between identities, between self and other. When closeness replaces structure and intensity replaces boundaries, collaboration becomes fragile. The moment the environment changes, the entire system destabilizes. And that's what makes dynamics like this so difficult to recognize while they're happening. They don't begin with hostility, they begin with alignment, with chemistry, with a sense that something rare and powerful is unfolding. It's only when that closeness is tested by visibility that its true nature becomes clear. When a partnership collapses in the way Coop and Nic's did, the temptation is to search for a single mistake, a decisive moment where everything could have been fixed. But dynamics like this rarely hinge on one wrong move. They are the result of an imbalance that grows quietly, fed by unspoken expectations and unmet emotional needs on both sides. From Coop's position, there was no clean or obvious solution. He was dealing with something that had no clear name at the time. Nic hadn't crossed an explicit line, hadn't made a demand that could be openly rejected, hadn't said the thing that would allow a direct confrontation. What existed instead was a growing weight in the room, a tension that couldn't be pointed at without turning vague discomfort into accusation. And accusing someone of something they're not ready or able to see often doesn't create clarity, it creates escalation. In situations like this, distance is not avoidance, it is containment. By becoming more formally professional, by reducing intimacy without hostility, Coop wasn't punishing Nic, he was protecting both of them from a confrontation that could only have ended badly. He chose not to expose Nic's vulnerability, not to shame him, and not to dramatize something that was still unfolding beneath the surface. That choice came at a cost, but it was not a moral failure. It was a realistic response to a situation with no gentle exit. For Nic, the loss of that closeness was devastating precisely because it was never fully acknowledged. The fantasy he had built did not collapse through argument or rejection, it dissolved through silence. And silence is particularly cruel to someone whose sense of self has become entangled with another person's presence. Without a clear conflict to fight against, Nic was left alone with his own interpretation.
The distance didn't just end the partnership in his mind, it erased the meaning he had assigned to it. This is where many creative and professional relationships quietly fail, not through malice, but through asymmetry. One person experiences the bond as collaboration, the other experiences it as identity. One sees a project, the other sees salvation. And when those interpretations diverge, no amount of talent or chemistry can hold the structure together. There's an important lesson here for anyone working in intense, high-pressure environments. Chemistry is not intimacy. Shared struggle is not shared ownership. And closeness, when left undefined, can become a breeding ground for projections that neither side consciously intends. Boundaries are not a rejection of connection. They are what allow connection to survive without turning destructive. If you recognize yourself in Coop's position, understand this. Choosing distance does not make you cold. It means you recognized a dynamic that could not be safely negotiated in words. You are allowed to preserve your autonomy, even when the other person is hurting. Compassion does not require self-erasure. And if you recognize yourself in Nic, the takeaway is not shame, it is awareness. Admiration becomes dangerous when it replaces self-definition. When another person's attention starts to regulate your worth, your mood, or your sense of direction, the problem is not them shining, it is the absence of ground beneath your own feet. No partnership, creative or otherwise, can survive being turned into a mirror. The quiet unraveling of Coop and Nic is not that one of them was wrong and the other was right. It's that something genuine existed, but it was asked to carry a weight it was never meant to bear. What ended the partnership wasn't conflict, it was the collapse of a fantasy that could only exist in isolation. In the end, the most professional and often the most humane choice is to let the work speak, keep the space between people intact, and accept that not every powerful connection is meant to last. Some are meant only to show us where our boundaries are and what happens when we lose sight of them. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, or if you've witnessed a similar dynamic unfold quietly around you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden psychological structures behind relationships like these, subscribe and continue with the next story on the channel.